So since last year, I have recently completed a pretty large project that I was working on, I think, when we last spoke, but I'm not sure we ever got to it. We talked about other things, and this was brewing in the meantime. So this project was, it was called In Which Blank and Others Discover the End, the blank being an actual blank in writing. And this was a very big multidisciplinary collaboration between myself, writing and also performing, Supergroup, the local contemporary performance dance group, Liz Miller, who's an installation artist based just a little bit outside the Twin Cities, and Brute Heart, a local band. So it was all these groups coming together to collaborate on a piece. We were pushing around some big questions about climate change and what contemporary performance can possibly contribute to the conversation. This project built from the last collaboration that I did with Supergroup, which initially was looking at big moments of life change for different people that we were talking to. We were unpacking these stories people were sharing with us and kind of looking for patterns across them and thinking a lot about the tension between stability and risk. And so in looking at those patterns, we started thinking about the very mundane, small things that accumulate in our lives to create the bigger sort of dramas. And climate change it kept coming up as this interesting example of that, these little actions that we take every day that accumulate into this big and somewhat abstract concept, large phenomenon of climate change. And so when we started working together again on this next project, we took that as our starting point in some ways and started thinking about how can we take that question, this question of our relationship to climate change further in a physical practice. So where does this knowledge live in our bodies? How can we think about our habits of thought, our sort of tendency towards binaries, categories, when things are actually much more fluid and interconnected. It gets very big and abstract to explain, but basically we were pushing all of these things around together in our processes as we were creating movement, as we were creating text, music, and a large-scale installation. And so we put all these things together in a kind of a slowly unfolding performance project at Public Functionary this past spring. Public Functionary being at a gallery in Northeast Minneapolis. And the installation went in first, Liz Miller's piece. It was an installation that the public could walk through as they visited the gallery. We opened that up first and then had rehearsals that were open to the public in the space over the course of a couple weeks, and then closed the gallery just for a few days in Tech Week and installed lighting, brought in the band, and then had a run of about, I want to say 10 performances, 8 to 10 performances. It already feels like a long time ago now. Basically 2 weekends of shows that were a little more formal sit-down performances. And also throughout that whole month of events, we had a number of groups come in and take over the space. And so they had like website launch parties and album release parties for groups that were unrelated to our project. Different kinds of community dialogues happened in there, things that were separate from our project and not even necessarily thematically related, but interacting with the project and just kind of opening up the space of what conversations could happen in that context. And so that was really interesting to see sort of the ways bounce happened between what we were creating and the different groups that were coming in. So that was that was what I was working on almost up until now. But that ended in April, and over the summer I've been working a little bit with Planned Parenthood in St. Paul, creating a public art installation there, and I'm also working on several new play projects, one with Red Eye Theater, and one continuing this kind of question about how climate change can be productively, meaningfully addressed in theater through another project called the Hive Project, which is a collaboration with a few other theater artists across the country and bees and beekeepers. So I can go into any of those worlds if you like, or I don't know if you have questions about any of that can of worms.
It all interests me, and I just finished an interview with Mark Winston, who was coming up for work with the Bee Collective. So,
excellent.
I in the middle of a bunch of bees, we did the bee interview, and the bees participated by not stinging me for a period.
It's kind
but
of them.
I want, I think, to go back almost to the beginning and to hear a little more about the transition between your earlier project and this one, and that business about the small actions or that add up, and you're thinking about how that would somehow be part of a theater piece. It sounded fascinating, but it went by kind of quick. Could you say a little more?
Sure. Well, to give a little context to that process, so I'll rewind even more. Prior to living in Minnesota, I worked for some time with Cornerstone Theater Company in Los Angeles, which creates community collaborative theater. So it's a professional ensemble of theater artists, and they are continually engaging different communities to unearth and tell stories from those communities and with those communities. So people from those communities are telling stories, performing, creating the work alongside the professional artists. And they define community in different ways. So sometimes it's a geographic community, sometimes it's, say, a community of beekeepers, or people who work with the prison system, or any way you want to define it. People with the same birthday, they've done those projects for their own anniversaries. So they're a really interesting company. They've been around for more than 30 years now, I think, or going on 30 years, I suppose. And they were very formative when I was first starting to write, formative in my thinking about how to cull stories from the world around me, how to ethically think about how I'm using those stories, not just taking people's stories and using them for my own purposes, but really thinking about how I'm in conversation with the world around me as I'm writing. And so that went with me as I started writing my own plays. And then I also spent some time in Poland between that season and graduate school. And in Poland I was observing a lot of very physical theater, very physical visual work that I was extremely drawn to. So when I got to graduate school for playwriting, I was starting to think about how to bring together the kind of the engagement with stories that I was gathering from my own community and from other communities, and this very physical and visual work that was pushing my writing to more experimental places. And I had decided at some point that I was going to gather stories from people in my life about moments of transition in their world. And so moments of kind of physical transition, spiritual transition, moments of epiphany, kind of moments when you knew something was big and different for you. And so I started gathering these stories, I started writing from these stories, and I just was not liking anything I was writing. It felt phony, it felt, it just wasn't working somehow. I didn't know what to do with it. And so I tabled that for a long time. And then I moved to Minnesota. I met Supergroup. I saw the work they were creating, and I was really excited about kind of their parallel paths of exploration to mine. So it seemed like they were exploring some similar things through movement that I was exploring through writing. And in fact, I had met one of the members of Supergroup initially, Jeffrey Wells, through Cornerstone Theater Company back in Los Angeles. He had attended a summer institute there and had come back a few summers to work on staff there. So we had this kind of background that was shared, these questions that were shared. And when we started working together, or we started talking about working together, I mentioned that I had this project. I had all these stories I had gathered from people and wanted to work with them in some way, both from my own interest and to honor the stories that had been shared with me, knowing it was for this piece that I wanted to write. I wanted to keep revisiting them and come back to them. So as a starting point, just to explore working together, not even with a specific project in mind yet, my work with Supergroup started by revisiting these stories that people had shared with me about transitions in their lives. And when I first started writing from them, I had felt this kind of need or responsibility to use the stories in a recognizable way. So sharing kind of fictionalized versions of the stories, but such that someone could see it on stage and think, oh, that's what I shared. I see myself in that, I recognize that. And when I started working with Supergroup, we decided, just for the sake of experimentation, to take away that particular sense of responsibility and just spend time with the stories, write in response to the stories, meditate on them, and see what came of that. So I generated a bunch of text that was unstructured for the most part, structured in small sections, but kind of modular, can be moved around. More poetry maybe than play writing per se. Just meditations on the stories that had been shared. And I started looking across the stories. That's when I started really looking more for relationships and patterns and things like that. And what I was finding was, or what hit me kind of at that point that hadn't hit me before, was that a lot of the stories people shared with me were, they were not kind of what you might expect when you think about transitions in people's lives. You know, for me, one of the first things I thought of were, you know, the births, the deaths, the marriages, the big new jobs, these big transitions. But what people shared with me really were more mundane. I was in a country for the first time that I had never been to and had this encounter with a stranger on the bus. Or I was looking out the window on a bus or on a car trip and having thoughts that put life in perspective for me. Or there was a story from being at war, and it wasn't a big event that happened in the war, it was a false alarm moment. But it shifted, all of these moments were the moments that were coming to mind for people as they were thinking about shifts in their thinking. And so we started thinking, you know, dramatically. That's kind of the opposite of what you think of when you think of sort of dramatic theater. You think of the big moments of tragedy or catharsis, you know. And this was sort of presenting a totally different kind of structure. It was presenting an accumulation. What is the significance of these little moments that cause these big shifts in thinking in us? And if you try to break them down, they become smaller and smaller and smaller as you think about, like, well, how did you get on that bus? You wound up there because you made this choice here, and or this coincidence happened that led to this change in your path. And so the text became reflective in some ways of that, those patterns that we're unearthing. So the text became more meditative, it became more, it's not a dramatic text, so to speak. It's a collection of fragments, and they are, in some cases, very repetitive, with small shifts in the repetition. So we started exploring ways we could do that with the text, and then also let the movement reflect both the stories themselves and then the text that was emerging from the stories. And so we did some workshops together where we were looking at different kinds of structured improvisations that would kind of get at some of those patterns we were finding. We culled movement directly from text and then layered it, sometimes with the text we had culled from, sometimes with different text to see what kinds of happy accidents kind of bubbled up. We played with dipping in and out of character, so letting semblances of character bubble up and dissipate. All these different things, and that basically turned into our first piece together, which was called It's All Highly Personal. Because with all of this stuff we were pushing around, we were also thinking a lot about the personal versus the collective, and the blurry lines between what is me and what is you, what is my action and what is the actions of my environment, or what is happening in my environment that is directing my action or informing my action or influencing my action. And so the piece was called It's All Highly Personal, and to some extent that's speaking to the very personal, small, deliberate things that we each choose to do. But then the all was in brackets in the title, and it's referencing we're actually all very interconnected. So that was that first piece, and there were hints of kind of ripple effect themes that were resonant in that piece, such as climate change, such as mortality, that were coming up, and we wouldn't probably say that piece was about those things, but they were present, they were resonant in the material, and also in some of the original stories that had come up. So that was interesting to us, and something we felt like we wanted to dig deeper into, and that's what led us to work together again on the second piece. It's a long answer to your question.
No, it's helpful. How does it work, coming home from a session working with this gang? What happens between sessions? How does one session motivate the next one? I mean, do you come home and pull your ears off because it was just so terrible or frustrating? Do you skip all the way home? I mean, for some reason, what I want to know is something like, not so much what you do at your sessions, because you kind of told me that, but what does it feel like when you come home and feed the cat?
Yeah, I love this question. We worked together, Supergroup and I worked together really over a period of 3 years, and for most of that time we were meeting 3 to 4 times a week. So usually 2 to 3 rehearsals and 1 to 2 meetings to talk about what's going on at rehearsals and to plan for rehearsals and to take care of all the other producing logistics. And so that's to say, we worked together for a while, and the things that happened between sessions varied as much as life does in 3 years. Some days we come home completely energized, we felt like we were moving forward. Some days we come home just not knowing what in the world we are doing. Wondering, if we're getting anywhere at all. Interestingly, we worked with the same cast of dancers for both pieces. So we had a cast of 7, and that included myself and the 3 members of supergroup, and then 3 additional performers. And over the 3 years, we've had 3 pregnancies, I think, in that group. 3 pregnancies, 2 marriages. A lot of life events, various people passing away. And so we've really gone through life together. One performer was 8 months pregnant when we did the first show. I don't know how she did it, but she was dancing harder than anyone else up there. Had the baby several weeks later after we closed. That baby was now at rehearsals with us sometimes for the second piece, and another performer was expecting when we were rehearsing that, and actually had the baby about 2 months before we opened, and still did the show as a new mom. It's just been incredible to see kind of both the kind of mundane daily lives that we've gone through, and then the big cataclysmic events that we've been through all together. And to think about to let all of that simmer as we're creating the work. So, on days where it felt like we weren't getting anywhere, or we didn't know, we lost track of our questions, or, are we trying to pack too many big themes into one production? Sometimes these kinds of questions would come up. And what I found really comforting was that we didn't have to know yet. We were creating the work over a longer period of time, and we could let those questions be in the room with us as we kept doing the work, which for us was a lot of generating movement, generating text, and then layering those things together and starting to refine and cut things and move things around as we shaped the piece. So there was a patience about the work that I appreciated. Often in theater, you rehearse a piece for 4 to 6 weeks, maybe 3 to 6 weeks if you're lucky, and then you do it and it's done. New plays tend to be developed over a longer period of time, but even so can be on a kind of accelerated calendar compared to this kind of process. And I really appreciated being able to stretch out in this kind of process and let the questions be. Let them be there. Let them be there with me as I'm feeding the cats. Let them be there with me as I'm cleaning the house, moving houses. I've moved twice in the past 3 years, often in the midst of these rehearsal processes. And it's all informing the process in some way.
What gives you continuity between your sessions? I mean, I have a sense that for a lot of performance, there's something like a drill sergeant with something like a clipboard that says we've got to go through section 2, it was a little rough yesterday, etc. How do you get enough continuity that you end up with a piece at the end?
That's a great question too. We were working very collaboratively, so we didn't have one single person with a clipboard, which means we had a lot of meetings to determine how we would run rehearsals. For the latest project, one of the members of supergroup just decided she needed to simply perform instead of also kind of conceive and produce. And so I was working with just 2 of the members of supergroup, mostly for all of that part of the work. And mainly, we had mapped out kind of a loose idea of how the process would go in terms of, this block of months we will be exploring in this way, revisiting some of the material from the first piece, recontextualizing it, thinking about it in new ways. And then we kind of had a place on the calendar where we were like, okay, around here we need to start at least having a kind of order of the piece that we can start running sections. So we'll have to make some decisions about things that should be in the piece and things that maybe should not be in the piece by that point. And so, it's a lot of slow conversations, meetings to figure out what we're going to tackle, meetings to revise the plan. A lot of things change sometimes in the moment when we run out of time, or things come up and we don't get to everything we wanted to do that day. There was just a lot of communication that had to constantly be happening among us to kind of come to consensus about where to put the focus. That said, we did have, we did allow ourselves to kind of fall into some roles, especially towards the end as we were getting closer to production. So I, as sort of the resident writer, even though we all contributed to the writing, I made some decisions about ordering the text in the end that people were happy with, and we kept. It was always open to discussion, but I ended up doing a lot of that kind of scripting. And then one of the members of Supergroup ended up doing a lot of the directing and rehearsal, kind of running the rehearsals and making some of those choices on the fly about let's put that movement in this section and run it a few times and see if it works there. So we did fall into those roles a little bit, and I think that was good for pushing forward, because we could. The danger, of course, with consensus-based collaboration is that you can just spend forever in these circles, and if you can't come to an agreement, then you get to this stalemate, and it can be very difficult in that way. But we also have a very good working vocabulary together, where I would say we kind of innately trust each other's intuition and artistic impulses, and so it was a collaboration where we were often able to just say, let's do this spontaneously, let's try this, let's look at this way, and then we would go back and have our meeting and talk about it, and if we disagreed with something, we would work it out. But often we were right there with each other in the choices that we were making in the room, and so that allowed for a really nice, swiftly forward-moving process amidst the long time frame.
Do you think it helps that you're going to be together for a while, likely? So anything that gets lost this time will get picked up? I
think there is something to that. I am not a member of Supergroup, and so this project was our last one together for now. But just within the framework of the project, there was definitely a sense of, we'll try this for a while. We can always go back to this. Let's put this on the back burner for now, but know that it's in our toolbox. There's definitely a sense of that material could be revisited, and we have a nice long chunk of time to work together. So nothing's too precious in that sense. We don't have to cling to things and worry that they're going to go away. I think that was helpful.
Now, your discovery from your work on transition stories was that they are in some way subtle and smaller than you might expect. What kind of challenge does that produce for dancers? I mean, it's helpful if the story isn't subtle, if you're trying to put it out there and have people read it.
Yeah, well, yeah, and this is something we were very curious about, because as a performing artist, you're always wrestling with here's what I'm interested in exploring, here's what I'm creating, and then here's this audience that is going to watch it. And what is the relationship of this work to this audience? What is the experience of the audience? Are they going to be bored out of their minds? Are they going to relate to it? How do we make it something they can enter into and feel invited into? All these many, many questions that we ask with every piece. And with this one, we really wanted to be investigating the material in an honest way, and so we didn't want to put our worries about the audience experience in there too early. But especially as the piece evolved, we were thinking quite a lot about how the audience would be experiencing it. Because we did end up having some there are some sections that are kind of slow and durational, and the movement changes in a kind of subtle way. So we address this in a few different ways. One is that just for the piece itself, we were looking at, what are the transitions that happen, what is the timing of the transitions that happen, whether they are very subtle or whether they are abrupt. And we did have some kind of bigger shifts happen. When and why are those happening, when they are happening? We weren't orienting from the idea that we needed to keep the audience entertained or even happy, because we wanted to invite the audience into to experience it from wherever they were at, and if they were finding themselves uncomfortable with the slowness, we were interested in creating an environment where they are able to question that discomfort. So why am I feeling restless with this? What does it take for me to relax into this? Some audience members will ask those questions and others will not be interested in asking those questions. And we can't control the experience for every person. But that's part of why we were making the piece as a performance piece for an audience to experience, is that we were interested in kind of asking those questions of ourselves and of our audiences collectively. So what am I projecting into this space? What images are coming up for me? What events from my own life are coming up for me? What kind of feelings of comfort or discomfort or patience or impatience am I feeling? These were all things that we were bringing into the room. And we had a place in the space, a public functionary, where Hannah Geil Neufeld, who's a local artist, created sort of an archive wall of audience experiences at the performance. So it started before the performance even started. So during the open rehearsals, and then also during the performance run, there were little kind of booklets with some questions in them that audience members could respond to. And then they could hang them on this little archive wall, and people could read other people's experiences. And so that was available as a way to kind of prompt thinking as people entered into the space or as they left the space, as they were processing their experience. We were interested in, if they wanted to engage with that before the performance, it would give them some things to chew on and think about that related kind of to the themes and questions we were pushing around. And if they didn't want to engage with it before the performance, that's also fine. But if they are leaving with questions, maybe they will find some interesting things to think about in that archive on their way out. So that's one kind of strategy we took. Hannah also was blogging about our process as kind of an outside eye throughout our rehearsal process in the months leading up, and then also during the performance run. As another kind of point of access, we called her the process correspondent, and she wasn't there to explain the process so much, but to relay her own kind of observations of it and experiences of it toward offering one kind of glimpse in as an audience member that could be of interest to other audience members. So Did I answer your question?
Yeah, but I'm interested sort of in how it mattered or how much it mattered what happened to your audience.
Mm.
Because, I mean, a lot of people say, well, the audience is everything,
Yeah.
but I can really tell a lot from how they clap.
Uh-huh.
And I always think, no, you can't.
Well, Minnesota, everyone gives every show a standing ovation, so
I mean, no,
it's
you
hard to
can't.
know what they're really thinking.
But I can feel these waves of warmth suffusing me. Well, if you can feel them, buddy, fine. But, I've got a bridge I want to sell you.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, it may not matter as long as you have an audience and they don't hate it and somebody writes a decent review and you have fun. But I'm wondering how the audience mattered to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we were really interested in making this piece something that was shared with the audience. So we were not interested in having these questions ourselves and performing them in this kind of insular way that feels like a big inside joke or something. And I think that is actually like the fear a lot of audiences have going to see contemporary performance, and especially for a lot of people, contemporary dance, because unless you're kind of ensconced in that world, you feel like, I don't know if I'm getting this, I don't know if I'm like understanding what I'm supposed to be understanding. And there are certainly some artists who kind of have their agenda and say like, if you don't get it, you don't know what I'm doing, who are abrasive like that. But and no judgment on them, because they're doing their own, they're approaching their work in their own way. But for us, that's not the experience we were interested in audiences having. We wanted to bring some questions to the table that we felt were not just questions that affected us, but that affect all of us as we think about our impact in the world and the urgency of climate change. And these bigger questions about our habits of thinking as a culture and as individuals within a culture. How can we kind of share, offer up those questions in a way that is inviting people in to think about them themselves. That's what we were interested in creating for our audience. And so, that informed decisions that we made about staging and about the piece itself. The mix of, in this version, the first piece that we did together, It's All Highly Personal, it was largely kind of poetic text layered with the movement. In this version, we played a little more with having some kind of scenes with characters that kind of bubbled up and then went away again, but some different styles of speaking and dialogue that were not just poetic. So there were sections that were kind of poetic blocks, but then other sections where it was more like a conversation or like a kind of, I'm sharing a story with you, the audience right now, which I think helped people enter into it and relate to it on a more kind of familiar level, and then they could let the other text wash over in a different kind of way, or different images and evocations were coming up for them having heard this other dialogue. So some of those considerations were things we were thinking about as far as ways to create that kind of environment for our audience. And then we also, actually towards the end of this piece, there was some audience participation that was totally optional. And one thing we were also not wanting to do was put people on the spot or make people feel uncomfortable as far as being forced to participate. But we were interested in getting people activated a little bit. We were curious about, you're watching people do a lot of movement for an hour and a half almost. And as we think about all the ways we have knowledge that are not necessarily things we can articulate, different ways knowledge is stored in our bodies, different habits that are stored in our bodies. We were curious what would happen, for an audience's experience of the piece if they were invited to be activated a little bit in participation. So the way that worked in this piece was that before the show began, we approached a certain number of people who were coming to see the show to see if they would be willing to read some text at the end of the piece. And the text was scripted on paper, and we passed it through the audience. And it started out as a conversation between the performers, and then audience members started joining the conversation, and then by the end it was just a conversation among the audience that they were reading from the pages, and all the performers were moving but not speaking anymore. And so the audience was really carrying the conversation, and the movement was happening in direct response to the words. And so that created this really interesting environment where if you had been kind of zoning out or checked out, suddenly you were checked in because you are responsible for the unfolding of the ending of the piece. And we weren't looking to make people feel responsible, but that is what happened. Talking with people after the first few experiments with it, they talked about really feeling this sense of responsibility and desire to make sure the piece went okay, or that things happened as they should, which was so interesting to us and kind of beautiful in this sort of sense of creating. It created a sense of shared responsibility in the room, a collective responsibility, and so thematically, we just found that kind of poetic and lovely. And real also. It was an experience people had where they had to kind of go through what is my task here. Not everyone read, but I think some people thought maybe the script would be passed to them, even though the readers were planted. People who were not reading saw the scripts moving and wondered if it would be passed to them. So there was a little bit of that anxiety. But from that then flowed a monologue by one of the performers that ended the piece, and we experimented with it right up to the end. We actually, in the first weekend of shows, we also had a prompt in the script that invited audience members to come move on stage after they read if they wanted to, and we had a few people who did, but then we had a lot of people who did not, and we also kept fudging with how they would know when to move off the stage in a comfortable way. And the second weekend we ended up cutting those directives and simply having the audience read, mainly because we wanted it to be, it was out of respect for their experience. We were still experimenting with how the movement would work, in a way that was enjoyable for the audience and not anxiety-inducing. And we decided we had kind of experimented with it as far as we could in the format of the performance as it was happening and unfolding live. And for the final weekend, we just thought maybe we'll take out that piece. We've learned what we can learn from it for now. And people seem to enjoy the experience of reading. Let's just leave it at that. So that's a very kind of direct approach we took in terms of exploring what the audience experience would be. And the content at the end that they were reading actually was a collage of text that was adapted from reviews of other performances about climate change. And so it was looking at Cynthia Hopkins' This Clement World, and the Civilians had done a play a while back about this kind of, I didn't actually get to see it, but it was, it sounded like a really hilarious, energetic musical about climate change. And a lot of other performances and plays about climate change that are out there, they're clearly wrestling with some of the same questions that we have been wrestling with in terms of how do you talk about it in a performance context? How do you have any kind of meaningful advancement of the conversation, a lot of what people end up doing is sort of regurgitating some of the facts and the arguments that are happening in the news or in science communities or in political spheres. And we felt like we didn't want to do that. All of that is available on the internet or wherever else you might encounter it. We wanted to get under the skin of it in a way. And so most of the performance was us pushing to get under the skin of these ideas. And then towards the end, I came to kind of see that section as an acknowledgement of the kind of unfinished or imperfect nature of this work, that it's not done when the performance is done, that we're still asking these questions as we go, as we review, as we kind of unpack what happened, and as we acknowledge sort of the artists that have come before us working around this topic and the artists that will come after us pushing it around. And so there was also kind of an implicit something for the audience to chew on there too, of how am I critiquing this show, how am I analyzing my experience, how am I looking at whether it was successful or whether it was not successful, how am I defining success as I move out of this experience. Maybe success is actually irrelevant, maybe the questions that I'm leaving with are the point or are more important to chew on. I don't know if everyone experienced that section in that way, but that's how I was thinking about it by the end.
Moving forward into the more recent ventures, are there any clear takeaways from that past thing? Is there a subtotal that you are carrying forward?
There are definitely things I'm carrying with me for sure, things from that ways of working from that process that I would like to continue. Working over 3 years with this group, it felt like a practice more than a project. And it's a practice that I find myself missing in some sense now that we are finished for now. But that's spurring me to think about how I am continuing that practice in my own writing practice and in my own work. I also, one of the big things I've been thinking about moving from that into continued thinking about the Hive Project, which is this small, it's a cycle of short plays about bees and bee-human relationships. What I'm thinking about a lot with the Hive Project and what my collaborators and I have been discussing is how that project is more deliberately engaging people outside the art community. So like for the supergroup work, we certainly were engaging people outside the arts community to come be part of the audience, but the work was created by this cohort of artists. And for the Hive Project, my collaborators and I, and we're spread across the country, there's some in Los Angeles, I'm here, got some in New York. We're looking at those 3 different geographic regions as hubs for the project as it unfolds. But what we'd really like to do is be in conversation with beekeepers and with beekeeping communities and with other people who are interested in sort of the different themes that are coming up in the plays outside of the arts community. And of course it's all relative, because as soon as you say outside the arts community, what does that even mean? Because so many people identify as artists in different ways. So I don't want to exclude anyone for that reason either. But we'd like to expand the conversation in that sense and kind of look at how actually we're really interested in like how local bees can influence the design of the production in each place, how we can work with scenic designers to collaborate with beekeepers and local bees in creating the actual design, which will vary a little bit in each place. Whether it's through beeswax creations, whether it's through video projection from hives, whether it's through local honey being part of the performance in some way, tastings and different things bookending the performances. We're exploring a lot of different kinds of ideas about how do we kind of raise questions and invite all this sort of critical thinking and visceral experience through the performance process, but then also really actively, and I keep using the word meaningfully, engage collaborators outside of the arts to just take the conversation further. And I think, you know, there are many ways that could happen that are very finite, but I think I am continually just becoming more and more interested in how these conversations can stretch over years of time, how these artistic processes can stretch over years of time, so that we find ourselves at the weddings and we find our collaborators with babies, and it's we're living life together, and the work is part of that, but it's not just a project, it's the work, it's the investigation that we're doing together.
You've decided to invest a serious part of your creative youth in bees. And I guess I'm always interested in investment and kind of, you could have done fish, you could have done kangaroos, could have done ants, you did bees. And I'm sure there are financial reasons why bees are a better deal for a dancer.
Well,
but I'm also
those financial resources.
I guess I'm curious about what it is that makes you glom onto bees, or bees glom onto you.
Yeah, it might be a little of both. You know, the Hive Project, it initially was sparked by two writers in Los Angeles who I've known for a long time, Guy Zimmerman and Gray Palmer, and they were reading, they were in a writing group together and reading a bunch of texts, animal studies texts, and thinking a lot about animal-human relationships, and they started becoming interested in bees initially. And I wasn't part of the process at that point. But when they started thinking about writing short pieces about bees, and they approached me about it. And I, you know, at the time there was and continues to be lots of questioning in the news around colony collapse and what is going on and what is the reason, and at this point, you know, there are all kinds of answers that seem pretty clear, but it was such I was attracted to it, I think, not only because it did seem urgent and timely and important, but also there was something so poetic and evocative to me about what happens if the bees disappear. Just in a very simple, it just, as they go and as things stop, you know, as they take so much with them, and as you begin to see the breakdown of our interdependency. I just found that such rich territory for thinking not only about bees, but about kind of many of the big social issues of our time, not to get too grandiose, but so many of the pressing problems in our world can't just be addressed in an isolated way. They're bound together with other things, and that alone is something I think that can be very difficult for us to wrap our brains around as a culture. We want to kind of categorize things. We want to like address this one thing, but you have to, you have to be looking at the economy as you're looking at the prison system, as you're looking at the military, as you're looking at education. All of these things go hand in hand. And so from bees, from these little specific existence of bees, I started thinking about all these other big things, and not like I'm trying to pack all these things into the one play, the Hive Project, but thinking about what are our tendencies as people, what are our habits of thought, what are the things we resist and what are the things we want to believe, or what are those hang-ups? How can I get at some of those as I write? And bees felt like such a powerful way in to that. And I think that those habits of thinking are something that I am addressing in pretty much anything I work on. It's just something I'm continually interested in. But the problem of bees in our current day is such a rich place, and there are just so many interesting communities around bees in this country, and I've been starting to learn about them more and more. There's an enormous, incredibly interesting and rich bee enthusiast community here in Minnesota that I'm only beginning to get to know. But through the university and through all these small businesses, these small farms and community farms, and there are all these people coming at bees from different angles, and so it's very interesting to me to see who comes to the table when you start talking about bees. You get a really interesting cross-section of people, and so that also attracted me to this idea of spending time thinking about bees, investing time.
Well, bees are dancers.
They are dancers.
I don't know that ants are, but bees are. So have you met any bees?
Yes, I've met some bees. I actually just visited recently a beekeeper out in Eden Prairie who keeps what he calls natural hives. And I'm still learning about all the many different ways that people keep bees. But he created these really beautiful structures. I mean, they're sculptures in and of themselves. These wooden structures where the bees live. And he has a very kind of non-invasive approach where he kind of just lets them do their thing. And he's got little windows where he can like peek in at them. But otherwise, he lets them be. And those were some of my favorite bees that I recently met. They seemed pretty happy doing their thing.
Are you going to have a comparable collaborative process in putting together a work around the Hive Project as you had before?
It will be a different kind of process, but certainly comparable in that it will be a true collaboration, and it will be over a long period of time, I think. We've written these texts on our own, so that's different already in that we've sort of written these plays that could just be plays themselves out in the world, but we're really using those as a springboard for this this project. And it may be that we produce those plays with this kind of team of collaborators that includes beekeepers, or it could evolve from there, and maybe there will be other artistic contributions that come into the mix. We're in the process right now of building a community around the project, getting to know people in each of our cities who are interested, and developing kind of a base of people who will be in conversation around this project. And then the boring part is that we are also trying to figure out the funding side of things. Because any of these wonderful ideas that we want to pursue involving a production, bringing bees into the performance arena in some way, is going to require some funding. So we're in that phase of research and development.
I'll bet it'll be interesting to watch beekeepers move. They can't flap. The bees won't like them.
No.
They have to move. I'll bet they have to move in a pretty interesting way around bees.
Yeah.
Can't prove that, but I know a couple.
Yeah, I think it's true. It's really beautiful to watch beekeepers with their bees. And different people have different approaches. Some are much more like, I put on the suit, I can just go in and kind of do whatever, and I'm just moving things around, and it's very practical. But then others have much more of a desire to not interfere too much, and so then the movement becomes much more careful or much more deliberate or slow. And I really have loved thinking about the movement of the beekeepers and the bees, and the movement of the bees. They're just incredible, the dancing and the way they chain to each other to create these structures inside with the beeswax. There's so much for an artist to cull from bees.
Thank you.